I'm going to do something a little bit awkward, and that is repeat everything you say. And that's not because, well, it might be because I'm making sure I heard you correctly today, but it's mostly for the benefit of people online so that they can participate and hear the discussion as well. And for those online, welcome, and I apologize if I forget to do that. We're going to start here in about 2 minutes. We're going to give about 5 minutes extra time as people are still coming in, and then we will get started with our fall Bible study. Welcome, welcome. Hello, hello. Did the Browns win today? They're playing right now? Oh, wow. Good for you guys. Suffering for Jesus. It wasn't looking good when you came? Well, I'm sorry for your loss. The Steelers lost today too, so there's some consolation, right? That was a difficult game to watch. It was winnable, and yeah, that's all I'll say about that. It's still too fresh for me. Well, welcome everyone to the Fall Bible Study. We are going to be looking at the Scroll of Samuel. And I say the Scroll of Samuel because the books of 1st and 2nd Samuel were artificially divided. It would have been one whole story, but it was divided because of scroll length. There's only so much you can put together in one scrap of scroll, and so it was divided into 2 sections. But it's all one story, and we're going to treat it as if it were one story, even though it's 2 separate books. And we're going to look through the entirety, and we're going to follow the story of 3 people. That is Samuel and Saul and David, because each one is tied into the broader narrative of what God is doing with the people of Israel and how God interacts with the world through the people of Israel. And so that's what we are going to do throughout the next 8 weeks. But before we get started, is there someone who would be willing to open us up in a word of prayer tonight? Thank you, Kathy. Amen. Well, Kathy, I really appreciated your prayer because you did recognize that what we're going to be reading and studying is indeed history. It is a retelling of the story of Israel, but Israel tells its story different than we're used to reading history. We read history and we think of it as just a combination of facts. And you might have a narrative that's part of it, but it's really just conjoined facts going together. When the Israelites wrote history, they were telling a story. And it wasn't a story of what was happening to the Israelites. It was a story of how God was interacting in the world. That's why when we begin reading in the entirety of the Bible, it begins with God. In the beginning, God created. God is the primary actor. God is the one who is the mover and shaker. And God is the one who is moving the pieces on the board, including Israel, to achieve his ends. And so it begins and it ends with God, and the rest of it is just how do the rest of the world interact with God himself. Now, in any history case, we don't usually start at the beginning. So what I mean by that is if I asked you to tell me the story of the American Revolution, you probably would not start with the shot heard round the world. you could start there, but you'd be leaving a lot on the table. You'd be leaving the questions of, how did we get to this point, right? How did we get to a war between colonies and England? If you really wanted to tell that story, you would probably back up to, well, the founding of the colonies. You would talk about the American culture that developed separate from Great Britain in the colonies. You would talk about taxation. You would talk about representation. You would talk about English Parliament and the king. You would do all of these things because to really understand the story of the American Revolution, you have to understand what came before it to lead up to that point. And so that's what we're going to do tonight. We're not actually going to read anything in 1st or 2nd Samuel, even though this is a study on 1st and 2nd Samuel. We will get there, but what I want to do was instead to back up to the books that came before, the books of Joshua and the books of Judges. Because what we'll find in those is the lead up to what we are going to experience in 1st and 2nd Samuel. And it's going to answer a lot of the questions of how did we get to the points that we do in 1st Samuel, what led to them, and why are the people acting in the ways that they acted. So that is my goal for tonight, is to just take a brief look at those two books to see what we can learn about the Israelite people so that we can better understand what's happening in the scroll of Samuel. First, I want to ask 3 questions, and they're very broad questions, but I think it will help us to frame in a new way how we think about the Israelites. Because if you're like me, I tend to look big picture and especially read things towards the end of the story and then superimpose that on stories at the beginning. So when I think of Israel, I think a lot of like 1st century AD Israel, the time of Jesus, where you have a very clear monotheism going on, right? You have a very refined culture. You have a very clear and understood religion that's tied to that. And so whenever I think of Israel, I think of that, which comes into conflict whenever I try to put that and that culture in the earlier stories of Israel. Because we're talking about a culture, talking about a nation that has existed for, 3,000 years. Almost 4,000 years at this point. That is a very, very long time. And think about how much has the United States changed since its conception. Right? We have a tenth of that at not quite 300 years, right? That we've been around, and we have been shaped incredibly during that amount of time. And so think about how much more so the Israelites might have shifted. So the first question I'm going to ask is, did the Israelites have a defined religion? The second question I'm going to ask is, did the Israelites have a defined culture? And the third question I'm going to ask is, did the Israelites have a defined government? So religion, culture, and government. So first question, did the Israelites have a defined culture? I know I just said those out of order, but we're going to start with culture. So was there a thing that you could say, oh, this is what it means to be Israelite? Well, in first century Judaism, or first century Israel, that was certainly the case. There were certain things that made you part of the Israelite culture. The 3 things that we often bring up, and they are tied to religion, would be circumcision, right? Would be the calendar laws and the food laws. Because every Jew that you ever met followed those 3 things. They became very important, and they actually became the things that set the Israelites apart, where the rest of the world, where the rest of the Greco-Roman world didn't engage in any of that. The Jews said, no, this is part of who we are. You also had the Psalms, you had the wisdom literature that we're working through right now, you had the prophets, you had hundreds and hundreds of years of poetry and songwriting and literature and all of these things that were baked into the cake of what it meant to be Israelite. However, if we look back to the earlier stages that we're going to be reading here today, we find that there isn't nearly as much of that culture. Because, well, do we have the Psalms? Not really. The majority of the Psalms were actually written by David, who isn't born yet at the beginning. Um, Now, that isn't to say that there weren't songs, right? So if we think about the crossing of the Red Sea, we have the recorded song of Miriam, right? And singing songs to the Lord about how great God is. And so it's not to say that there isn't any of that, but there aren't those songs that make the Israelites the Israelites. So again, going back to my United States narrative, there are certain songs that have become kind of ubiquitous for America. You think of like, God bless America, right? We all know that. That's part of kind of who we are. That wasn't always the case, right? But it grew up in our culture such that, all right, now we sing God Bless America. Or you think of the national anthem that we play at every ball game ever. Like every kid that played baseball in the United States knows that because it's part of our culture. You might even say that baseball is part of our culture, right? Or American football. These are the things that make us who we are. And the Israelites will get that, but at this point we are very, very early on in Israelite history. We think about who they are. Well, they're just a conglomeration of tribes that have been slaves for a very long time in Egypt. It's very hard to create your own culture whenever you are slaves. It's even hard to create your own culture whenever you are a minority in a much bigger, more oppressive culture. Oppressive not in bad, but oppressive as in the rest of the world knew Egyptian culture. The rest of the world knew how to speak Egyptian and knew hieroglyphs and things like that because Egypt was so dominant. It was the powerhouse of the ancient world. And so for a small group of people to say this is what makes us us would be very difficult. And that's what we find whenever we go into, well, we'll look into the story of Judges. And so if you want to turn with me to the book of the Judges, to chapter 3. This is what it says. This is 3 verse 1. Now these are the nations that the Lord left to test Israel, those in Israel who had no experience of any war in Canaan. It was only that successive generations of Israelites might know war to teach those who had no experience of it before. The 5 lords of the Philistines and all of the Canaanites and the Sidonians and the Hivites who lived on Mount Lebanon, from Mount Baal Hermon as far as Lemahamath. They were there for testing Israel to know whether Israel would obey the commandments of the Lord which he commanded their ancestors by Moses. So the Israelites lived among the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. And they took their daughters as wives and gave themselves for themselves, and their own daughters they gave to their sons, and they worshipped their gods. So here at the beginning of Judges, and we know from the scriptures that the Judges were a period of about 400 years. So think the length that the United States has been around and then 100 years, right? This is a long period of time, but it begins off by saying that the Israelites came into the promised land, and they didn't actually drive out everyone who was there. We read the same thing in the book of Joshua, chapter 13. Yeah, 13, where it says that Joshua didn't actually complete the conquering of the land. If you remember, God promised everything from the Sinai all the way up to Lebanon and from the Mediterranean Sea all the way over to the Tigris and the Euphrates. If you think ancient world maps, that's a huge chunk of land. But what they actually conquered was a little slice of that, smaller than New Jersey. That was what the Israelites conquered. And so there were these remaining peoples in the land that were not driven out. And we find out at the beginning of Judges that the Israelites were not very good at obeying the commandments of God. And so when you think about Israelite religion, again, going back to did the Israelites have a unique religion, the answer is, well, they really didn't. In fact, I would argue that almost every Israelite around was a polytheist, which means they worshipped many gods, of which Yahweh was the most important, but certainly not the only one. And you can imagine why this would be the case. Again, they lived in Egypt. Egypt worshipped many, many, many gods. They were there for 400 years. That is a very long time to live in a culture with worship, with God not really showing up at all. Remember, we have our last instance of God showing up in the book of Genesis with Joseph, right? And the next time we have is with Moses. Now, did God show up in dreams or in other ways? He might have, but we don't have any record of it. And so we have these old ancient stories of the Israelites who were told about their father's God, who did all these amazing things, the things that we read at the end of the book of Genesis with Joseph and the 7 years of famine and the 7 years of plenty, right? We know these stories, and they would have been told as stories, but there wasn't really this idea of God as the one and only God. In fact, I did a study on the book of Exodus one time where I argued that the golden calf was actually the Israelites confusing Yahweh with another of the Egyptian gods and saying, oh, this Yahweh is this other God, and so we're going to worship this other God in the way that we know how, despite the fact that God explicitly said, don't worship me in that way. And so the Israelites coming out of Egypt very likely were polytheists. That yes, they worshiped Yahweh, but he was one of many, many other gods. Now, God said, I want to be worshipped above all other gods. You shall have no other gods before me. But the question is, were the Israelites going to live in accordance with that? In fact, if we go to the end of the book of Joshua chapter 24, so this is after the conquering of the land, even though not everyone was driven out, right? And Joshua gathers all of the Israelites together while he is basically on his, not on his deathbed, but he knows he's going to die here soon. And he gives a speech to all of Israel. And so this is Joshua chapter 24, verse 14. This is what Joshua says to the people. Now, therefore, revere the Lord and serve him in sincerity and in faithfulness. Put away the gods that your ancestors served beyond the river, that is, beyond the Euphrates, and in Egypt, and serve the Lord. And so, what is he saying? He's saying, put the gods away from you that your ancestors worship. Who are the ancestors? That's Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. That is because that's the across the river, so that is when Abraham was in Ur, right, coming back through. And that's the Israelites when they lived in Egypt. And so right here in the scriptures, we have the Joshua stating that Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and the other Israelites that came before worshipped other gods alongside of Yahweh. But now Joshua is saying, put those gods away from you. We're not going to worship them anymore. Instead, we're going to focus on Yahweh because he is our God. He is the one that chose us. He is the one that performed wonders and defeated all of the gods of Egypt. He's the one who brought us out of Egypt. In fact, that's why when you read through the pages of the Old Testament, whenever God talks about himself, he says, I am the Lord, the God who brought you up out of Egypt. The Israelites' first real sense of identity came not from themselves, but it came from Yahweh. Yahweh was the one who chose them, and they were special because of that. And so we hear that the people were still polytheists. They were worshiping other gods, but there was a command and a push to put those away and worship Yahweh alone. Did they do it? No, they were awful at it. And that's actually what we read in the book of Judges. And so if you look at Judges chapter 2, verse 11, we get basically a synopsis of what the entire book of Judges is going to be about. So this is, again, chapter 2, verse 11, after the death of Joshua. Then the Israelites did what was evil in the sight of the Lord and worshiped the Baals, that is, the other gods around them. And they abandoned the Lord. And so not only did they worship the other Baals, but they actually worshiped them above Yahweh. And so they abandoned Yahweh and worshiped other gods before him. And so not only were they disobeying the push to only have Yahweh as their God, but in fact they were disobeying the commandment of God himself to not have any gods before him. And they abandoned the Lord their God of their ancestors, who had brought them out of the land of Egypt. Again, we have that phrase. They followed other gods, from among them the gods of the people who were all around them. And they bowed down to them, and they provoked the Lord to anger. They abandoned the Lord and worshipped Baal and the Ashtars. And the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel, and he gave them over to plunderers who plundered them. And he sold them into the power of their enemies all around, so that they could no longer withstand their enemies. Whenever they marched out, the hand of the Lord was against them to bring misfortune, as the Lord had warned them and sworn to them, and they were in great distress. Then the Lord raised up judges who delivered them out of the power of those who plundered them. Yet they did not listen even to their judges, for they lusted after other gods and bowed down to them. They soon turned aside from the way in which their ancestors had walked and obeyed the commandments of the Lord. They did not follow their example. Whenever the Lord raised up judges for them, the Lord was with the judge, and he delivered them from the hand of their enemies all the days of the judge. For the Lord would be moved to pity by their groaning because of those who persecuted and oppressed them. But whenever the judge died, they would relapse and behave worse than their ancestors, following other gods, worshiping them and bowing down to them. They would not drop any of their practices or their stubborn ways. So the anger of the Lord was rekindled against Israel, and he said, because this people have transgressed my covenant that I have commanded their ancestors and have not obeyed my voice, I will no longer drive out before them any of the nations that Joshua left when he died, in order to test Israel whether or not they would take care to walk in the ways of the Lord, as their ancestors did. The Lord had left those nations, not driving them out at once, and had not handed them over to Joshua. So, we see here an interesting dynamic, and I love that passage because there is not a better recap of a book than that. If you don't even have to, well, I'm not going to say that. If you only had 5 minutes to read the book of Judges, you could get a sense of what actually goes on by just reading this, because that's what Judges is all about. It's the people disobeying God, worshiping other gods, and God punishing them by letting all of their enemies that they were surrounded by come in and take all their stuff and kill all their people, and then they would cry out and they would raise up a judge like Barak and Deborah and Ehud and Gideon and Samson, and then the Lord would be empowering that person to drive away through war all of the enemy nations, and then the people would regress and it would all start over again. And it's actually a downward spiral. If you read through the book of Judges, what we find out is even the judges are getting worse and worse. So again, you start with people like Ehud and Deborah, who are incredibly upstanding people, who are valiant and have faith in God and do all of these incredible things. And then you get to people like Gideon, who is the most overrated person in the entire Bible, who is like a whiny mess that needs 8 zillion signs before he's going to believe in the Lord. And even then, he is like dragged kicking and screaming to actually do his job. And then you get people like Samson, who was not the greatest man. He was prideful and arrogant and a lecher, and ended up using his strength for his own benefit most times, or just to settle a grudge, and ends up dying amongst all of the people that had imprisoned him in kind of one final desperation, where he said, Lord, just let me die with this. So we have this downward spiral. So as the people keep regressing and honestly getting worse in their regression, so the judges are getting worse and worse, even in their ability to lead the people. And we'll see that whenever we get to the beginning of 1 Samuel, it's still an overlap of the book of Judges. So the Judges and 1 Samuel overlap at the beginning, because we find out that Samuel is actually the last judge of Israel. We'll read that in chapter 7. So we have this people that don't really have a religion of their own. They kind of have it in the Ten Commandments and in the Torah, but the Torah wasn't widely written down. It's not like every bookstore you can go to, you can buy a Bible and read the first 5 books of the Bible. Very, very few people had any written language. In fact, very few people could even read at this time. And so the things that they had were the oral traditions and the commandments that were passed down. But if you have a people that don't know or don't care about the rules, are you going to pass those down? Unlikely, right? You're not going to tell your kids, hey, here are the rules of this God that we're abandoning and not following. No one's going to do that. And so you have generations of people that are losing some of these stories, and it's just becoming kind of a religious mess, because each of these gods that were around them had different religious practices, had different ways of worship, including Yahweh. So Yahweh in the Torah gives his commandments and his special ways of worshiping and all of that. And so it's just a big mess on the religious front. We also find out that it's a mess on the cultural front, because The Israelites, it says, are going around and they're marrying everyone around them. And so they're giving their daughters in marriage, and they're bringing in daughters from the Philistines and the Hivites and the Jebusites and the Girgashites, and their sons are marrying them. And one of the things that my father always said whenever I was starting to date was, you don't marry a person, you marry a family, which is very true. And whenever you marry a family, the culture of that family shifts the way that your own family develops, right? I think about my relationship with my wife. My family is an odd breed. We are country folk. We've got farmers and hunters, and that's who we are. My wife's family are city folk. They are from D.C., and they are not used to driving more than 10 minutes to get to anywhere, whereas we had a half-hour drive most of my life to get to Walmart. And so the way that our children are growing up are a mix of both of those. And the cultural, or the values that our families have and the way that we communicate, you think about how much that changes people and children and generations. Well, we see that intermixing here in the beginning stages of Israel in the land of Israel. And so what does it mean to be Israelite? Well, if you ask any Israelite, you're going to get a zillion different answers, because no one really knew at the time. Yeah, you had some songs, you had some practices, but it was very much up in the air. And then you think about the government of Israel. Well, we know that there were the 12 tribes of Israel, and if you look on the screen, I have a map of where the Israelites were supposed to settle. Now, if you think about it, that's a really weird map to have, isn't it? Because we're not talking about like individual people and where they're supposed to live. So if you think about, again, early America, as homesteaders were heading out west, you would have a family that would sit down, and it would be like one family, and they would own that land, and then they would develop it and grow it, and they might divide it up among their children, or they might spread it out, but there weren't like giant groups of people that went and settled a place. But when the Israelites came in, they were the 12 tribes. Their identity was with their tribe. Even more than maybe being Israelites, they were Gadites, or they were Zebulunites, right? And God seems to kind of even double down on that by allotting particular geographical areas to different people. So what's something that you notice about that map up there? It is not even at all, right? If you look, I know it's kind of hard to see, so you just might have to trust me on the wording up there, but you can see the colors. Judah is in purple. You might think that, does it have a laser pointer? Oh, you're the best. There we go. Everybody online, you're just going to have to imagine the green laser pointer, but they can see a little bit better. So we have Judah in purple. If I were looking at that map, I would say that Judah was the favorite, right? Not only because it has a lot of land, but you can see that it has coastal, it is here to the Dead Sea, it has a lot of, if you remember from our geography of the Holy Lands, that main trade route coming from Egypt, it controls half of it, and all of those major cities. Compare that to little Benjamin here. Benjamin has some of the least amount of area. It is cut off from any of the major trade routes that go on either side of Israel. It does have the King's Highway running right through it, but it's kind of stuck there in the middle with nowhere to go. Same thing with Issachar. And then you have the 2.5 tribes over here that are separated from everybody else by the Jordan River. And the Jordan River is actually a pretty big barrier. It was much bigger at this time than it is now. There were only a couple of places that you could actually forge to get across the river. There weren't like bridges that you could drive across like we have today. And so even just looking at it, we have very, very disparate land distributions. What's another thing, again, thinking along geography lines about what we see up there? Any of you who were at the Geography of the Holy Land Bible study? Yep, so we have Manasseh here and Manasseh here. By the way, is Manasseh one of the 12 sons of Israel? No, who's Manasseh? Joseph's son. So Joseph had two sons, Ephraim and Manasseh. Two sons that we care about. And so they are here. Manasseh gets cut into two half-tribes that we think about. And so that's why we talk about the half-tribe of Manasseh on one side of the Jordan and the half-tribe on the other side of the Jordan. But if you think about, and by the way, if you're new, anytime there's a long silence, I'm just counting to 8 in my head. And so it's long enough to be awkward, but don't worry, we'll get there. But if you think about the land of Israel, especially when we talk about geography, it's a very different land. We talked about down here in the south, especially where Simeon is that very nice, fertile land? No, that's all desert down there. That's all wilderness, like the wilderness of Zin that the Israelites wandered around. Like, that's their land that they were given. Yes, there's Beersheba in some of these larger towns, but those are towns that are built around a well where you can drill or dig for water. Compare that to, say, the area of Naphtali. The area of Naphtali is in the north, where there is lots of rain coming off of Mount Hermon, which is there. Or you can think about right in here. This is Mount Carmel, and remember we have the Jezreel Valley. We talked about how lush and fertile. That's the breadbasket of Israel. And so you have Zebulun and Issachar right down in there. Even Asher, which also has connections to Tyre and Sidon and those major trade routes with the Sidonians. And so you think about, again, going back to the United States, how much different is California than backwoods Ohio? A little bit different culture? Is it the same kind of thing to live in Miami Beach than it is to live in Cleveland? Yeah, quite a bit. And again, we are a country that has existed a lot shorter time. But think about how much different those cultures. I mean, you think about even just red and blue states, right? We talk about that all the time. And the different culture that arises in a two-party system. We have a 12-party system here that are separated by a lot of major geographical regions that have a lot of the different kinds of farming and agriculture and trade amongst them. And so if you're developing in your region locked in these areas, think about how different these 12 tribes were. Which is one of the reasons why we don't actually see any kingship in the 12 tribes of Israel. We have the 12 tribes that have their own family heads, and I'm sure they had different ways of electing, whether it was the oldest or the wisest or the most powerful or who had the most money. We don't actually know how they were elected or chosen, but we do know that each of the 12 tribes had elders or leaders that made decisions for the tribe, that focused on the tribe's well-being over and above everybody else's tribe, right? It's very hard to have a cohesive culture and religion and government structure when you're so separated like this. And that's actually what we see in the book of Judges. So I want to pay attention to a few stories. The first one, if you turn your Bibles to Judges chapter 9, we're actually going to see the first king in Israel. Or at least that's how it's described here. So Judges chapter 9, this is right after the death of Gideon, and it talks about Gideon's son. By the way, how many children did Gideon have? Anybody want to take a guess? Well, if you look right up to, right before that in Judges chapter 8, verse 30, or 29, Jerubbaal, son of Joash, went to live in his own house. Who is Jerubbaal? What? Yep, that's Gideon. It's just a different name. So Gideon is Jerubbaal. Now Gideon had 70 sons, his own offspring, for he had many wives. And his concubine was in Shechem and also bore him a son, and he named him Abimelech. So this is a story of Abimelech. That is Gideon's son, but not his in line for the throne son, not that they had thrones. This is a concubine who was born to him, all right? So there's 70 sons that are real sons of real wives, and then there is a concubine who had a son. We all tracking with that? Okay. It is different culture. Again, even our heroes are not quite what we would expect from heroes. But it's Gideon, and he's overrated. So now, chapter 9, verse 1. Now Abimelech, son of Jerubbaal, which is Gideon, went to Shechem, to his mother's kinfolk, and said to them, and to the whole clan of his mother's family, say in the hearing of all of the lords of Shechem, which is better for you, that all 70 of the sons of Jerubbaal rule over you, or that one rule over you? Remember that I am also bone of your bone and flesh of your flesh. So his mother's kinfolk spoke all of these words on his behalf in the hearing of all the lords of Shechem. And their hearts inclined to follow Abimelech, for they said, he is our brother. So here we get a little bit of an insight into the workings of the tribes of Israel. Here we have Abimelech, who is a concubine son of Gideon, and all of his other brothers seem to be in ruling powers in Shechem and the surrounding area. Shechem, by the way, is right here, right on the edge of the tribe of Manasseh. And was actually one of the more important areas in the region. Shechem became one of the powerhouse cities in the area. And so he essentially starts a coup. And how does he start that coup? Well, he goes to his mother's, the concubine's family, and says to the lords of Shechem, again, this is a very powerful place, and says, hey, wouldn't it be better if instead of having 70 different people ruling over you, you just had one? And why not me? I'm, after all, your family, right? Not Gideon's other kids. They're not your family because their mothers were from other tribes. But I'm from Shechem. You know me. So let's make this thing happen. And that's exactly what happens. They give him their support, and he becomes the king, the ruler in Shechem, and then he goes and kills his 70 half-brothers. Except for one. He misses one. But this is not an uncommon story in the book of Judges. There is a lot of family squabbling. There is a lot of inter-tribe disputes. And there is a lot of power grabbing wherever you can. Even while all of the enemies are around and still are oppressing the Israelites, right? And so you have all of these threats from without and threats from within. No one is safe in the land of Israel. I want to jump ahead to a few other stories that kind of drive that home in the book of Judges. So if you turn to Judges chapter 12, this is right after the hero or the judge Jephthah came and attacked the enemies of Israel. We usually think of Jephthah for his stupid vow. Remember, he made the vow to the Lord that says, when I get home, the first person who comes out of my house, I'll offer as a sacrifice to the Lord. And his daughter comes out, and he has to kill her. We think of him as being stupid and foolish for making that vow. But so we don't usually read beyond that portion because that's kind of the interesting, exciting part. But this is what happens in chapter 12. The men of Ephraim, so again, we're talking about the tribe of Ephraim here and the teal, were called to arms, and they crossed to Zaphon and said to Jephthah, why did you cross over and fight against the Ammonites and did not call us to go with you? We will burn your house to the ground over you. So Jephthah has just fought off the enemies of the Israelites, the Ammonites, and has won a lot of glory and won a lot of plunder, because again, when you kill the enemies, you get to steal all their stuff. This is the ancient world. And so all of the stuff, all of the wives, all of the livestock came with Jephthah. And the Ephraimites are upset about that because they didn't get to participate, and they didn't get any of the wealth that came with that. And so what do they say to their fellow Israelites? We're going to burn your house to the ground with you inside. That's how we treat the judges. Remember, this is a judge that God was with. And they tried to. Jephthah said to them, my people and I were engaged in conflict with the Ammonites who oppressed us severely. But when I called to you, you did not deliver me from their hand. So Jephthah says, I did call you, and you didn't come. You didn't come to help your fellow Israelites. You weren't called to arms. And so we had to do it ourselves, and God gave us the victory. When I saw that you would not deliver me, I took my life in my hand and crossed over against the Ammonites, and the Lord gave them into my hand. Why then have you come to me this day to fight against me? Then Jephthah gathered all the men of Gilead and fought with Ephraim. And the men of Gilead defeated the Ephraimites because they said, "You are fugitives from Ephraim, you Gileadites, in the heart of Ephraim and Manasseh." Then the Gileadites took the fords of the Jordan against the Ephraimites. Whenever one of the fugitives of Ephraim said, "Let me go over," the men of Gilead would say to them, "Are you an Ephraimite?" And they would say, "No." Then they would say to them, "Then say Shibboleth." And they would say Sibboleth, for they could not pronounce it right. Then they seized him and killed him at the fords of the Jordan. 42,000 of the Ephraimites fell at that time. So I want you to think about what we just read. This is the nation of Israel, right? But not only do we have inter-tribe war, but it also shows that it's brutal inter-tribe war. And it also shows that how different these tribes are, that the dialects don't even match up. Now, again, we're talking about an area the size of New Jersey, but you can think about it. I just spent a lot of time with a bunch of Texans, which the joke was because we had 7 different nations that had joined, that had affirmed the Global Methodist Church as an official religion. Right, so nations sometimes have to say, yes, this is an official religion that we're going to recognize for like marriage and burial and all that stuff. And the joke was that it wasn't 7, it was 8, because Texas also agreed to be in relationship with the GMC. But you all know the Texas drawl, right? And you can say, oh, you're not a Yank, are you? Right? Because I can hear it in your voice. Well, we hear here that like even among the tribes of Israel, there are dialects and ways that you talk that are distinctive among the tribes, such that the Gileadites could kill the Ephraimites by hearing how they answered different questions and spoke. And so we have a lot of violence going on. And that violence actually comes to a head if we turn to Judges chapter 20. So the precursor to Judges chapter 20, we got to get moving, is there was a Levite who was going through the land, and he had a concubine, and he stopped in Gibeah and was resting there on his travels. And the men of Gibeah, which is in Benjamin, so that is right there. They stopped there, and the men of Gibeah came to the house that they were staying and pounded on the door and said, "Send out the traveler who is with you so that we can rape him all night long." Does that sound familiar? Or does it sound familiar? Sodom. We have here with the Israelites, the people of Benjamin, repeating the story of Sodom. And it is dealt with in almost the same way as the story of Sodom. Remember, they wanted to rape Lot, and or they wanted to rape the angels, and Lot said, "Don't do this. Take my daughters and rape them instead." Now, the angels in that case turned everybody blind. They weren't angels in this case. It was just a Levite and his concubine. And so the man of the house said, "Don't do this terrible thing and rape the Levite. Instead, here, rape his concubine and my daughter." And they did. They threw them out, and they raped them all night long to the point where the woman died on the threshold. And I say rape so much because I want to drive home just how awful this is. And so the Levite gets up, finds his concubine dead, picks her up, puts her on her mule, then cuts her body up into 12 different sections and mails a section of that body to all of the tribes of Israel. I'm not making this up. That's chapter 19. This is a children's book. Some parts we don't necessarily read to our children. And so all of Israel gathers to find, because again, they got mailed a body part. This is pretty troubling for all the people of Israel. And so the 12 tribes gather, and they're like, "Why did you send us a chunk of this woman's body?" And the Levite explains what had happened, and he calls the people to arms. And so in chapter 20, all of Israel rises up to battle, rises up against Benjamin. And they say, "Hand over the people of Gibeah, hand over your fellow Benjaminites so that we can kill them and we can punish them for this evil thing that they've done." And what do the Benjaminites do? They say, "No way, Jose. And so the Benjamites actually go up and they start a war with all of the other tribes of Israel. And do they win? This means yes, or this means no, this means yes. No, they do not win. In fact, almost the entire tribe is wiped out. All of the men of the tribe are almost killed, and all of the women are taken as plunder by the other tribes of Israel. So much so that chapter 21 is the rest of the tribes of Israel saying, hey, maybe we went a little too far. We need to figure out how to save the tribe of Israel before it goes extinct. And so they work out a plan where there's a celebration and a bunch of the young maidens are dancing. And they say, hey, Benjamins, why don't you have some of your young men, while they're dancing out in the field, come and kidnap them and take them as your wives so that you all don't die out. That's chapters 19 through 21 in a nutshell. It's a crazy story. But again, it goes to show that there isn't really any camaraderie between the Israelite tribes, at least not by the time of the end of the book of Judges. They might as well be their own countries without real borders, so you can travel in between them. They have different cultures, they have different dialects, they have different ways of thinking and speaking, and they are loyal really only to themselves. Okay? There's one more thing that I want to make sure we cover, and that is religion within the land. And so when we get to chapter 17, there's a phrase that starts popping up, and it pops up 5 times in chapter 17 through chapter to the end of the book. And that is what we see in chapter 17, verse 7. Oh, sorry, not verse 7. Oh, sorry, chapter 18, verse 1. In those days, there was no king in Israel. And we see that repeated at the very end of the book of Judges. If you turn to Judges chapter 21, verse 25. In those days, there was no king in Israel. All the people did what was right in their own eyes. And we have in chapter 17 through chapter 18, we have the story of Micah and the Levite. And so Micah was an Ephraimite who lived in the hill country, so he was living somewhere in here. And he said to himself, I want to create a little chapel for me so that I can worship the gods. And so he went to his mother, and his mother gave him some silver, and he created an idol, and he created an ephod, and he made a little space in his house to be his place where he would worship God. Whether that was Yahweh or another god, we are not entirely clear. But it's an idol, so it's not what God wants anyways. So he creates this, and a Levite happens to be passing by, and he says to the Levite, hey, if you come and live with me and be my priest, because you're a Levite, and the Levites are supposed to be the priests, then I will take care of you. I'll give you a new coat, I'll give you a new set of clothes every year, and I'll give you 10 shekels, and you'll be like a father to me, and I'll be your son. Or I might have that backwards. And the Levite agrees, and he says, yeah, that sounds like a good deal. And so he lives with that person, and with Micah, and they have their own little sanctuary, and they worship whatever God in whatever way they think is best, because there was no king in Israel, and everyone did what was right in their own eyes. And so we see even here that this is a very small circle of worship, right? This is clearly not tied to going to the tabernacle or the ark or anything that we usually think of as like Israelite worship. We see that even household by household, there are different ways of worshiping different gods. Now, the rest of the story is the Danites, who were supposed to settle down here, got kicked out by the people that lived there. So they didn't have a homeland. And so we have here in chapters 17 and 18, the Danites are just a roaming tribe. They don't have any place to call their home. And so they send people up north into the area of Naphtali to start scouting out. And as they're going through, they have to travel from Dan through Ephraim to go up north. And they come by this guy's place. And the whole tribe, armed to the teeth, because it's just a bunch of men who've been kicked out of their homes, they say to the Levite, hey, it's much better for you to like be a Levite for a whole tribe instead of just one guy. And so why don't you come with us and we'll steal this guy's idol, and you can be a Levite and a priest for all of us. And if you don't, we'll kill you. And so the Levite says, that's the best deal I've heard today. And so he goes with them, and Micah comes and says, what the heck? You just robbed me and stole my employee. And they said, yeah, tough nuggets, we'll kill you too. And so he decides to go back home before they kill him. And then they go up into the area of Naphtali, which again, God allotted to Naphtali, and said, yeah, no, this is ours now. And so they captured a couple of cities, including this one up here, that they renamed Dan. And that became the tribe of Dan. And so we have these crazy stories, and this is the lead up to Saul. This is the lead up to Samuel and to David. This is the story of the Israelites as we are getting there. So I wanted to make sure we covered this because I don't think we truly grasp the things that are going on in the book of Samuel without understanding where the Israelites are. And I want you, because when we get to Saul becoming king, it's like, oh, great, Saul became king. Because the Lord chose him, right? And of course the Israelites would obey what the Lord said and do what, and follow whoever the Lord appointed, right? We literally had a judge that was attacked by other Israelites. And so I hope that by covering some of this, we will gain a new appreciation for some of the things that we're going to read about the ark and the tabernacle, about the kingship, about the coups that happened under David's reign, about what it means to be an Israelite, what it means to have a capital, right? What it means to have a temple. All of these things were entirely foreign to the Israelite people until we get to the book of Samuel. So, as we read through, I want you to keep all of these things in the back of your mind. And as we read through these chapters, I want you to make note of things that I would even circle them or write them down. They don't necessarily have to be tied to anything, but just take note of things that you previously thought you understood, but now as you're reading, you're like, oh, that's actually pretty wild that happens, considering everything that we just covered. The other thing that I want you to keep in mind is one of the themes that we're going to look at throughout the book of Samuel, one of the main themes is that God achieves his will regardless of what people do. That God is at work in the messiness of history to achieve his will. And we're going to talk about next week as we look at the Song of Hannah. We're going to find out that while God achieves his will, the best way to cooperate with God is through humility and by doing what God says. And if you do that, then things will go well for you. And if you don't do that, then things will go poorly for you. But we've gone over a little bit just because there is so much to cover. We did a Bible study on Judges in an hour. So good job, everyone, for sticking with me. But before we close our time, I just wanted to open it up to you all. If there are any questions or comments about any of the things that we covered, or thoughts about where the things that we talked about will come into play as we read through the book of 1 Samuel, I wanted to open it up because I know that I've just talked for an hour straight and talked real fast. So I want to give a chance for you all to respond. And we'll start with Sean because he had his hand up first. Yeah, I'm going to have you talk much louder. Yep. That's a great question. So the question for those online was, how did we get this map? How do we get those line borders and figure out where everything is? And the answer actually comes from the book of Joshua. So if you look in the book of Joshua, starting in chapter 13, we have God allotting particular land. So, for example, if we go to Joshua chapter 13, verse 24, Moses gave an inheritance also to the tribe of the Gadites, according to their families. Their territory was Gazer and all of the towns of Gilead, half the land of the Ammonites to Aor, which is east of Rabbath, and from Heshbon to Ramath Mithpeth, and to Bet-Tilman, and from Mahanaim to the Torrey of Debir, and the valley of Beth Haram, Beth Niram, and Sukkot, Zaphon, and the rest of the kingdom of the king of Shihon, and Heshbon, the Jordan and its banks, as far as the lower end of the Sea of Chinnereth, eastward beyond the Jordan. This is the inheritance of the Gadites according to their clans, with their towns and their villages. So, basically, chapters 13 through almost to the end of the book is just this. It is lists of city names and town names and valleys and rivers, closing in all of it. It's actually an incredibly boring read. Like people say, oh, Leviticus is so hard. No, Leviticus is not that hard. Leviticus is interesting. This is boring. And it has all these hard names that nobody knows how to say. Between that and like Chronicles are the biggest slog for me getting through. But that's how we get those territories, is the book of Judges, or the book of Joshua outlines where they are. But great question. There's another hand. Kathy. And the question was, where was the tabernacle at this time? And the tabernacle actually moved around. That is one of the nice things. The tabernacle literally is a tent, right? And like any other tent, you can pack it up and move it around. And so it was primarily at Shiloh. That's where it has its residence for the majority of this time. But the answer is it went to different places. And that's another interesting thing, is because it's a tent, is there a center of religious power in the land of Israel? Well, the answer is not really, right? There is, because the tabernacle can move around, and it can move around to different territories and to different tribes. And so think about the effect that might have on your tribe if it happens to be if the tabernacle happens to be in your allotment. Is there any pride that comes along with that? Maybe. Is there better adherence to the law and to the Torah if the tabernacle's in your place and the primary place of worship and of sacrifice is in your backyard? Well, let me just say this. How many of you would be willing to drive to Akron to go to church? For the right church? Maybe. How many of you would be willing to walk to Akron? You think that might have a shape on your religious... Like, what if Akron was the only church available? How important would going to church on Sunday morning be to you? A little different? So the tabernacle did primarily reside at Shiloh, but it did move around. And again, I want you to think about the effect that having the Ark of the Covenant and the tabernacle in your tribe might have affected the people of that tribe. Very good question. Other questions? Or statements? Or what? Shiloh is here. But actually, our first story is how the Ark of the Covenant is mobile. We're going to read that in our reading for next week, which, by the way, we're going to cover chapters 1 through 7. So if you read for chapters 1 through 7 throughout this week, we're going to cover that. We're going to hear the story about how the Ark of the Covenant was actually captured by Israelites' enemies because they thought that they could take it into battle, and it could be a magic weapon that would incite God to fight on their behalf to defeat their enemies. And God said, nope, and let them get defeated and let the Ark of the Covenant be taken. So, everything is mobile and can be moved around. Any other things from everything that we covered tonight? Well, as always, if things come to you in your sleep or while you're taking a shower or whenever those ideas pop into your head, that's the most inconvenient times. You have my email, you have my phone here. Feel free to give me a call, stop in at the office and chat with me. I would love to, again, this is my favorite part of the job, is reading through the scriptures and studying and unpacking what's there. And oftentimes the questions that you give me help me with that. Your questions make me a better pastor because I have to say, Oh, I hadn't thought about it that way. Let me dig. Let me see what the scriptures say. So I really do encourage that. For next week, we are going to again read chapters 1 through 7, which is the story of Samuel that leads us up to the monarchy. And again, keep everything that we've talked about in the back of your mind as you read through those chapters. And then I would just highlight or note, or if you have a notepad, write down the things that that we talked about today that made you second guess what you read, and bring those, because we'll talk about those for next week. But we are at our hour mark, and for the sake of Jeff and Caleb, who are watching the children, I try not to go too far over that. And so would someone be willing to close us with a word of prayer this evening? Oh, just under the gun. Thank you. Amen. Thank you all very much. I hope to see you all next week. And if you know anybody who's online or who wasn't able to make it here, this is all online, and we'll have it posted. Aaron actually has a great spot if you click on, is it Watch Now on the website? It's a drop-down tab where you can watch past services, but also Bible studies. You can watch all of the Bible studies on YouTube there. You can also watch past Bible studies if you want to catch up with any of that stuff. And so if you didn't get a chance, I encourage you to watch online. And then I will see you all next week. So God bless.